You think modern war crimes are brutal? Ancient Chinese siege tactics would be banned by the Geneva Convention today. Ancient Chinese sieges were psychological nightmares that turned entire cities into pressure cookers of violence, where societal norms collapsed and both attackers and defenders descended into levels of brutality that would qualify as war crimes by today's standards. We're talking about siege tactics so ruthless, they involved systematic starvation of civilians, biological warfare with diseased corpses, and mass executions designed to terrorize entire regions into submission. These weren't just military campaigns. They were exercises in applied horror that could break the human spirit before the first arrow was fired. But here's what'll really mess with your head. The most brutal tactics weren't accidents of war. They were calculated strategies, documented in military manuals, and refined over centuries. The Chinese didn't just perfect the art of war, they perfected the science of suffering. Ancient Chinese warfare spanned over 2,000 years of continuous conflict. Unlike European sieges that might last weeks, Chinese sieges could drag on for years, turning into endurance contests where victory went to whoever could inflict the most psychological damage. We're talking about armies numbering in the tens, sometimes hundreds, of thousands besieging major imperial capitals. When the Mongols besieged Chinese cities, they weren't just capturing territory. They were conducting experiments in mass terror that would influence military thinking for centuries. Chinese military strategists understood something that made their approach uniquely devastating. Breaking the enemy's will to fight was more effective than breaking their walls. They developed siege tactics that targeted not just soldiers, but entire civilian populations. Today, I'm breaking down the 7 most brutal siege tactics that made Chinese warfare a masterclass in calculated cruelty. But first, let me warn you, the final tactic literally brought down entire city walls from below. Let's start with the most fundamental tactic: complete blockade and systematic starvation. This wasn't just cutting off food supplies. Historical records describe this as calculated mass murder disguised as military strategy. Chinese commanders would surround cities with multiple rings of fortifications, creating what military texts called iron walls. But here's where it gets dark. They didn't just starve soldiers. They deliberately targeted civilians to break the defenders' will through mass suffering. The siege of Suyang in 757 AD shows how far this could go. General Zhang Shun defended the city for months, and when food ran out, historical accounts describe a situation that descended into absolute horror. Records state that Zhang Shun first killed his own concubine to feed the troops, reportedly saying, "You have performed many deeds of loyalty. Now perform one more." But contemporary accounts suggest it got much worse. The defenders began what historical records describe as desperate acts of survival, including reports of cannibalism among the civilian population. By the time the city fell, its population had been reduced from tens of thousands to just a few hundred survivors. Here's the brutal irony. Zhang Shun is celebrated as a hero in Chinese history because his sacrifice bought time for loyalist forces to regroup. But that wasn't the worst part of Chinese siege warfare. The next tactic was designed to break minds, not just bodies. Chinese armies perfected psychological warfare through systematic mutilation and public display of horrors that would make modern psyops look amateur. Attackers didn't hide their brutality. They showcased it like a medieval shock-and-awe campaign. During the Yellow Turban Rebellion around 184 AD, Imperial forces faced fanatical rebels who were difficult to intimidate. Their response was to create what historical texts call jingguan, celebratory mounds made from the severed heads of thousands of enemies. After victories, Imperial troops would behead thousands of rebels and pile their heads into giant pyramids outside cities still holding out. Some historical accounts suggest these head pyramids were built to last, using mortar, possibly made from lime and other binding agents, to cement the skulls together, creating permanent monuments to terror visible for miles. This tactic was so effective, it created a cycle of vengeance, ensuring surrender was rarely an option. When enemies expect no quarter, they fight with the desperation of the doomed, making every siege a fight to the death. But if you think psychological warfare was brutal, the next tactic literally weaponized disease itself. Centuries before anyone understood germ theory, Chinese armies were using disease as a weapon with scientific precision. This represents one of the earliest forms of systematic biological warfare in human history. The tactic was horrifying. Used trebuchets and catapults to launch diseased corpses, animal carcasses, and human waste over city walls. The goal was to trigger epidemics within the confined conditions of a besieged city. Chinese armies would collect corpses from previous battles, allow them to decompose for weeks to maximize disease potential, then launch them into enemy cities. Historical accounts describe specialized ammunition, containers filled with human waste, diseased animal parts, and rotting grain designed to contaminate water supplies. Archaeological evidence from siege sites shows specialized catapult ammunition designed specifically for biological warfare. These weren't improvised weapons. They were engineered delivery systems that could turn an entire city into a plague pit. The psychological impact was devastating. Defenders couldn't fight disease with swords or shields. They could only watch helplessly as their families died from invisible enemies launched over their walls. But the next tactic was even more treacherous. It destroyed the very concept of honor in warfare. Chinese commanders perfected the art of the false truce, exploiting the rituals of war to achieve treacherous victories. After a long siege, attackers would feign withdrawal or offer surrender terms. When defenders let their guard down, the attackers would break the truce and storm the city. During the fall of the Ming Dynasty, rebel leader Zhang Xianzhong became notorious for this strategy. After besieging Xiangyang in 1643, historical accounts suggest he feigned retreat, leaving behind spoils of wine and food. The starving defenders rushed out to claim them, breaking their discipline and leaving the walls poorly defended. Zhang's forces then turned back and easily stormed the now vulnerable fortifications. Contemporary records describe Zhang carrying out a systematic massacre of the city's population. The betrayal was so complete that survivors described it as the day trust died. This tactic destroyed the possibility of negotiation in future conflicts. If enemies couldn't be trusted, defenders were forced to fight to the last breath, increasing the bloodshed of every subsequent siege. But sometimes, the most brutal tactics came from an unexpected source, the defenders themselves. Sometimes the most brutal tactics were used by defenders against their own people. Scorched earth policies involved systematically destroying everything of value to deny resources to the enemy, including sacrificing the civilian population being defended. During the Three Kingdoms period, 220–280 AD, commanders like Cao Cao would implement scorched earth tactics that historical records describe as commanding their own troops to burn the fields and granaries of Chinese civilians in the path of enemy armies. The short-term goal was military survival, but the long-term consequence was famine and death for thousands of non-combatants. The brutal logic was simple. Better to destroy everything yourself than let the enemy use it. But the human cost was staggering. Entire regions would be turned into wastelands where nothing could grow for years. Archaeological evidence shows regions that took decades to recover from scorched earth policies. Some areas never fully recovered, remaining depopulated wastelands for centuries. But the next tactic took systematic cruelty to an entirely different level, turning mass murder into a science. After costly sieges, Chinese armies often sought to recoup losses through systematic terror designed to prevent future resistance. This wasn't random violence. Historical records describe calculated mass execution designed to send messages that would echo across entire regions. The Mongols were absolute masters of this tactic. When a city resisted and was taken by force, their standard procedure was what historical accounts describe as systematic massacre of inhabitants. Records report numbers that seem almost impossible. Entire populations of hundreds of thousands killed in organized slaughter. After the siege of Zhengdu, modern Beijing, in 1215, historical accounts describe the city being sacked and burned with immense loss of life. The Mongols organized the slaughter like a military operation, with specific units assigned to different districts. This tactic was brutally effective. Many cities, hearing the fate of those that resisted, would open their gates without a fight. The terror was so complete that the mere threat of siege was enough to secure surrender. But stick around for the final tactic. It literally brought down entire city walls from below. And the engineering involved will blow your mind. The final tactic represents the pinnacle of siege engineering. Underground warfare that could literally bring down the strongest fortifications through systematic structural collapse. Chinese armies developed sophisticated tunneling operations called didao that could undermine the foundations of city walls and towers. They would dig chambers under the walls, support them with wooden beams, then set the beams on fire. The subsequent collapse would bring entire sections of wall crashing down. The 6-year siege of Xiangyang from 1260 to 1273 shows this tactic at its most sophisticated. Historical accounts describe how the Mongols employed Muslim engineers who brought advanced counterweight trebuchets and intensified tunneling operations that systematically degraded the city's legendary defenses. The tunneling warfare created battles of wits and endurance in pitch darkness. For defenders, it meant constant, terrifying fear that the ground beneath their feet could give way at any moment. They would dig counter tunnels, trying to intercept enemy sappers in underground battles fought with knives and clubs in spaces too small to swing a sword. Nothing breaks morale like knowing your strongest walls could become your tomb. Archaeological evidence from medieval siege sites shows the sophisticated engineering involved, including drainage systems and air shafts that allowed tunneling operations to continue for months. These 7 tactics reveal a central truth about ancient Chinese warfare. They developed a systematic approach to cruelty that treated psychological warfare as a science. Chinese military strategists understood that siege warfare wasn't just about capturing cities. It was about breaking the human spirit so completely that future resistance became unthinkable. The human cost was staggering. Historical records suggest millions died not just from direct violence, but from the systematic destruction of the social bonds that hold civilizations together. When trust, mercy, and basic human decency become casualties of war, the damage extends far beyond any individual battle. But here's the most disturbing part. These tactics worked. Cities surrendered rather than face systematic starvation. Populations fled rather than risk biological warfare. The brutality was effective, which is why it persisted for centuries. Ancient Chinese siege warfare represents humanity at both its most ingenious and most brutal. These weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic applications of cruelty designed to achieve specific military objectives. The 7 tactics we've explored show how siege warfare could transform ordinary people into participants in systematic horror. When survival is at stake and social norms collapse, humans are capable of brutalities that seem impossible in peacetime. These sieges remind us that the thin veneer of civilization can disappear remarkably quickly when survival is at stake, and that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within human nature, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. War isn't just fought on the battlefield, it's fought in the human mind. If you thought these siege tactics were brutal, wait until you see the weapons that made them possible. Click here to discover the mechanical monsters and engineering marvels that ancient Chinese armies used to breach the strongest fortifications, and why even the most advanced medieval defenses were no match for Chinese military innovation.